river was frozen, the snow was coming down, and right at, as you might imagine, unknown to us, at 4 o'clock, Palm 90, Air Florida, had finally gotten out onto the runway, took off, and after a very brief sojourn in the air, crashed into the inbound 14th Street Bridge and then went into the river. So they were looking for the aircraft.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations.
This month marks the 40th anniversary of the crash of Air Florida Flight 90 and the rescue of 5 lives from the icy Potomac River, thanks to the creative heroism of the United States Park Police. This Bell 206L-1 helicopter, known as Eagle One, was the first artifact installed during our construction and is the first thing many visitors see upon entering the museum. For many, however, the role of aviation in law enforcement is often overlooked, so we think it's time to turn the spotlight on those guardians in the air. In today's program, we'll try to understand what happened 40 years ago and how U.S. Park Police aviation today looks different as a result. I want to thank our generous sponsor, Russ Matthews, who has supported not only today's program, but whose family's foundation has been a key supporter in bringing the restored Eagle One to our museum. We also want to thank the United States Park Police for their partnership and support in making this program possible. To get us started, I'd like to introduce Pamela A. Smith, Chief of the United States Park Police. Chief Smith is a 23-year veteran of the service. Starting as a patrol officer, she rose through the ranks to become only the second woman to lead this 230-year-old agency. Chief Smith, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Thomas, and good evening. My name is Pamela A. Smith, Chief of Police for the United States Park Police, a unit of the National Park Service. I am humbled to address everyone tonight as the head of the nation's oldest uniformed federal law enforcement agency with a long and proud 231-year history. It gives me a sense of pride to have the honor of acknowledging the heroic efforts of our Eagle One flight crew, pilot Don Usher and paramedic rescue tech Melvin Jean Windsor, who responded to the scene of the Air Florida Flight 90 crash on January 13, 1982, after it lost altitude, crashing into the 14th Street Bridge and plummeting into the Potomac River. The heroic and valiant efforts displayed by our crew, the bystanders, and our agency partners resulted in the rescue of 5 survivors. Our hearts still go out to the families of the 78 souls who lost their lives that day. Tonight, you will hear from others who will give a firsthand account of what occurred on that day. But you will also hear from our current United States Park Police pilots who will provide a more in-depth perspective of the technical pieces of equipment that we use today during our rescue missions. The present-day missions of the United States Park Police Aviation Unit include aviation support for our local law enforcement partners, medevac, search and rescue, high-risk prisoner transport, and presidential and dignitary security. The aviation unit has provided accident-free professional aviation services for over 48 years. This is primarily due to the dedication of the flight crews, the support from within and outside of the U.S. Park Police, and the state-of-the-art equipment used in the performance of their missions. I would like to thank the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund and Museum for our long-standing relationship and for tonight highlighting the heroic efforts of our pilots over 48 years ago. I would also like to thank you for also acknowledging the current role that we, the United States Park Police, play in the greater Washington, D.C. area. This relationship is vital towards fostering a constructive dialogue that helps to build strong relationships between law enforcement and the communities we serve.
Thank you, Chief Smith. The crash of Air Florida Flight 90 40 years ago was a surreal and tragic day that many here in Washington, D.C. still remember. Not only was there the loss of life due to the plane crash, but a fatal train derailment on the metro system, combined with a terrible snowstorm, made it a day for the ages. Thanks to the United States Park Police, on the very day of the 40th anniversary, we recreated the rescue flight from the Park Police hangar to the 14th Street Bridge and the site of the crash in the Potomac River. Flying around DC is a carefully controlled and restricted endeavor, and we're especially excited to share this unique experience with you right now. So let's take a closer look at that day to understand what it was like. In addition to the flight, we'll hear several perspectives to help set the scene, and we'll hear more details about the rescue itself. Look for stories from Steve Souder, who was on dispatch that day with the DC Fire Department. Lynn Herring, who was then chief of the United States Park Police. Chester Panzer, who famously recorded footage of the harrowing helicopter rescue. And Don Usher, previously recorded for a museum oral history project, who piloted Eagle One and helped save 5 lives that day.
Well, I was aware of what ended up being a little bit conflicting information because it was identified the carrier's name, Eastern Airline, was mentioned, and certain things like that. So you were trying to resolve those discrepancies in your head, but clearly you knew a horrible, horrible thing had happened because an airliner had definitely crashed. There was no doubt about that. It was in the midst of a roaring blizzard. It was in the midst of rush hour traffic with gridlock all over the city of Washington. It occurred when it was very, very challenging for the fire department to make its way to the scene of the event. Keep in mind, this was on almost the Virginia shoreline of the Potomac River. And for those that may not be familiar, in Washington, D.C. owns all of the Potomac River. It's part of the District of Columbia. So the responsibility for the response was the District of Columbia Fire Department, but it was absolutely at the far extreme edge of its response area, which made getting there more challenging in time and certainly more weather to encounter along the way. And with the traffic being what it was, every minute that passed by, the traffic congestion only got worse. So your problem of responding to the event was getting worse by the moment.
Well, it was a very difficult day because actually we had, as I recall, approximately 2 feet of snow, and it was still coming down very heavily. At that particular time, some of my people had gone home. I'm talking about the higher command, some of my deputy chiefs. But my photographer, Charlie Pereira, came into my office and told me that, asked if I needed anything. I said, I don't think so. And about that time, when I answered him, the police radio announced that Air Florida 90 had just crashed into the 14th Street Bridge. As a result of that, we both said, oh my God. And Charlie, being a photographer, he had his camera and backpack and all. He says, well, everything is totally gridlocked with traffic. He says, I'm going to jog across the bridge and take some still photographs. So he did that. He left in the cold, blazing cold, and he went over to take photographs. And about the same time, I'm getting a phone call from my Anacostia helicopter wing. My pilot, Don Usher, called, and the paramedic, Gene Windsor, was with him. And they said, Chief, we want to try to go do the rescue. And I said to them, I said, well, my goodness. I said, no one. I said, the military won't let their helicopter take off. Over at Marine One, they won't, nobody, the Metropolitan had a smaller helicopter than we had, but they wouldn't let theirs take off either. And to be very honest, in my general orders that guided the operation of the helicopter, stated that with the visibility the way it was, you should not take off. And so I was in a big predicament. I knew there was a great need. They wanted to do it. And I thought to myself, well, this helicopter's worth millions of dollars that I just got from Congress. And if, number one, not that it was just a helicopter, if I lose the helicopter and it's against my own orders that I've signed and no one else lets theirs go up, and besides, if I lose a trained pilot and a paramedic, 2 lives, my name is mud, and I'm going to be up before Congress testifying why I made such a stupid decision. I said to them, though, I said, after we discussed all of that, the problems, they said to me, Chief, we still want to do it. Well, that put the onus right back on me. There was no way of bypassing it. I had to make a decision. And I thought about it, but actually, if that was my mother or brother or someone, or my daughter that was out in that cold, freezing water and they could be saved, what would I want the chief to decide? And so I said, well, look, I'm not a pilot. So I said to Donnie, I said, what is the probability that this is feasible, that you can do it? He says, Chief, we want to do it. And he says, I think we can. He says, I flew some operations in Vietnam. So I said, if you feel that you have a decent chance of completing this mission, then God be with you and do your best.
I was working at WJLA TV as a news videographer at the time. I stayed there about 9 months after, and then eventually moved over to NBC, where I worked for 38 years. In those days, we were a 2-man crew, so there was a photographer and a sound man, and we used to bring our crew cars home with us with all our equipment. So I picked up my sound man, George Patterson. He lived in Arlington. I was living in Burke, Virginia at the time. And our first assignment, since it was snowing, it had snowed all through the night, and it was snowing that morning, was to shoot some snow video in Northern Virginia, and then to bring it into the station and have them air it in their noon news. It was snowing through the day. It was pretty treacherous going because a lot of the roads hadn't been plowed. There were enough people out there that you obviously had to be careful. We got around pretty well. After we shot the snow video in Arlington and brought it to the station in Northwest Washington, I think we took a lunch break, and after lunch, they sent us to Rockville for a working fire. Not long after that, we were dispatched to the airport, National Airport, with another reporter. So we got to the airport was closed. It was really crowded because there were no flights leaving, and people, I guess, were still coming to the airport expecting to fly away. All the other TV stations were there doing the same story. You know, the airport's closed, how long, how inconvenient, interview people. So we shot that story, maybe took us an hour. The assignment desk told George and I to go home, get some rest, and we're going to do the same snow drill the following day, meaning we would start really early and get more snow video, maybe do whatever stories were happening the next day. So George and I left the airport. We drove about 3 or 4 miles, and we're on the GW Parkway in bumper to bumper traffic over near the Teddy Roosevelt Bridge. We were sitting in traffic for probably 45 minutes or so, listening to the radio, just making small talk. And we knew it was going to be a long time before we got to Arlington because no one was moving. It was still snowing. And there we were with a lot of people sitting in traffic. After like 45 minutes, the assignment desk called us on our two-way radio. This is before we had cell phones. Called us on the two-way radio, asked us where we were. And then we heard some conversation. They were trying to reach other crews and they were giving their locations. And then there was this radio silence. And a few minutes later, they called us back, asked us again where we were. We told them, sitting in traffic near the Teddy Roosevelt Bridge. And someone on the radio said, we heard something about a small plane crash at National Airport. Go check it out. So George and I looked at each other and I thought, oh, okay. So he turned the radio over to WTOP All News Radio. And they were already talking about Air Florida Palm 90 had crashed. So they already had it on their air. And George and I, our eyes must have gone as big as saucers thinking, oh my God, this is real. So miraculously, the median strip on GW Parkway at that time had no guardrail. And I was able to maneuver the car up onto the median strip down on the other side of the parkway, heading back towards the airport. And one of the miraculous things that day, and there were several that happened that made the whole day kind of unbelievable. When I put the car down on the parkway going back towards the airport, there wasn't a single car on the road. It was just packed snow and there was no traffic. So George and I go speeding off, skidding down the road towards the airport, which again is probably about 3-4 miles away. As we're approaching the 14th Street Bridge, which is actually 3 bridges, we saw some flashing lights off to our left, our 11 o'clock position, which would have been towards the river. We saw fire, I think ambulance or something like that. Not a lot, just one. So we looked at each other and I stopped the car and we both agreed that we should stop and at least look in on what's going on there before we go to the airport. Because if we continued on down to the airport, we never would have gotten back to the accident scene because of all the traffic going the other direction. So I put the car up on the curb underneath the bridge to keep it protected out of the snow so we'd have a way out. You always need an escape route. And we grabbed our equipment and we went bounding through the snow, which was pretty deep. The grassy area probably had about a foot of snow on it up to our knees. And we went running over and we connected our gear together. And there was an ambulance there and we could see the lights flashing. And there were probably a good amount of civilians around on the river. And we could hear the helicopter. And that turned out to be the crash site. So we knew we were in the right place.
We actually left the hangar, went over to the police station across the field from us into the Anacostia facility, and visited there for a couple of minutes, and then figured, well, we better go back over and see what's going to happen. We were contemplating calling and taking leave because of the way the snow just kept coming, and it was cold. I think it was about 24, 25 degrees, and the river was frozen, the snow was coming down. And right at, as you might imagine, unknown to us, at 4 o'clock, Palm 90, Air Florida, had finally gotten out onto the runway, took off, and after a very brief sojourn in the air, crashed into the inbound 14th Street Bridge and then went into the river. So they were looking for the aircraft. They even asked one of the aircraft coming in immediately behind Palm 90, would you go down to the end of the runway and see if you see a Boeing 737 down there? And the aircraft that went down to the end said, well, we see tracks all the way down to the overrun, and then all the snow's blown out of the way where they essentially jerked it off the runway, and it kind of, the jet thrust blew all the snow out of it as it went off. At that point, somebody over in Washington National, and I believe it was in departure, picked up the phone, called us over at the hangar. And this was probably about 10 after we got the call, and said, "Are you guys flying today?" And I laughed and said, "No." And he said, "Well, what's up?" And they said, "We're missing an airplane, and it might be over in Roach's Run or somewhere up on that end." Now, Roach's Run, obviously our interest in Roach's Run is when the aircraft left on runway 36, which is where Palm 90 did, there's a water section right there, and then the George Washington Memorial Parkway, which is National Park Service property on the west side of the river. And to the east side is Potomac Park, which, once again, we're very interested in. So we ran out, started putting the aircraft together, and in an afterthought, grabbed a couple throw balls that had personal flotation devices inside of them. We'd used them before. It was a yellow softball size thing, and you would throw it into the water, and when it hit the water would set off a charge which would inflate the PFD. So grabbed a couple of those, which probably there was already one or two in the aircraft, but we grabbed a couple more. And then we tried to get the aircraft outside, but with all that snow, our towmobile couldn't get out. Now here's where my paramedic comes in. Ron Gailey also did snowplow work on the side. He had a plow on the front of his truck. He plowed the ramp while we rolled the aircraft out. So Gene jumped in with me while he was putting his truck away. And he just waved us on because we had already started up. So he stayed at the hangar. Gene jumped in with me for what we considered probably was a no mission.
Reported an Eastern Airline jet that crashed off the side of the 14th Street Bridge.
And the tower said, "Do not depart. The field is experiencing an emergency." And I said, "I'm aware of that. I'm responding to the emergency." And I said, "Okay, go ahead." So we took off. So as soon as we took off, we almost went into the clouds instantly coming off of the Eagle's Nest. I did a left turn, flew to South Capitol Street Bridge, flew across South Capitol Street Bridge just at a height above the lights so that I could maintain contact with the ground by looking through the chin bubble, looking between my feet, because looking straight ahead was nothing. It was just gray with the snow going by us. Flew up South Capitol Street Bridge to the Southwest Freeway, turned left. Everybody was stopped. No one was going anywhere. All the vehicles were stopped in all directions because they had just released all federal employees. So the whole place was just a traffic jam, but a lot of lights, which was good. A lot of lights for me to follow. So we flew down the Southwest Freeway, jumped over LaFont Plaza Bridge, came to the 14th Street Bridge, and Mother Nature cooperated and turned off the snow just for a moment, just for a couple moments. Our rescue equipment was the tow rope that pulled the helicopter in and out of the hangar. It was a rope that was about the size of my thumb with two metal clips on the end that we hooked on the front of the toes of the skids and pulled it in and out. That was our rescue equipment to that point. He took the throw balls, threw them in, the rotor wash blew them away immediately as soon as they inflated, off they went. So, okay, that didn't work. That didn't work like we thought it would. Gene dropped the rope to Bert Hamilton. He put it around himself. We lifted him out of the water, flew him, and as we came to the bank, there was a tree in the way. And an ambulance sitting right on the edge of the bank. So we're hovering right above the tree, and the firefighters pushed the tree over and dragged it out of the way so we could get in. And they had to find the driver of the ambulance and get him to move the ambulance back so we could actually hover over the ledge in the bank and have Bert Hamilton removed from the tow rope. So that took about 4 minutes of maneuvering and yelling on the loudspeaker and trying to, we were taking this as it came. So we dropped Bert off. He was fine. We turned, went back to the fuselage again. Gene dropped the rope. It was passed around, and then the next thing you know, Kelly Duncan, the stewardess, was the next on the rope. Now, what was scary, we later learned, was she didn't hook it around herself. She took the open rope and wrapped it under her arm twice, and the rope was hanging free, and the only thing that was holding her to the rope was it was hooked under her armpits, and somehow she kept her arms down without letting her arms go like that and the rope fly off of her. So we picked her up about 25 feet in the air and flew her to shore and dropped her off. Didn't know that she hadn't hooked the rope, that it was just wrapped around her. Like, whew. So while we were over there, Gene and I said, this is taking too long, one at a time. They've been in the water now a long time, but we got to speed this up. So we asked if they had any other equipment. And again, that radio, that mutual aid, no one was answering that radio, so I just gave up on the mutual aid, and we talked by loudspeaker with the people that were on the shoreline. I just used the helicopter loudspeaker, and they nodded yes or nodded no. And the next thing I know, they ran over with what's called a throw buoy that you would use, and the buoy was about this big around. It wasn't meant for a person to go through. It was meant for you to put your arms through, with about, and I think it probably had about a 25-foot rope. They threw that up to us, so off we went. Gene tied it in, so now we had a throw buoy and a helicopter tow rope as our rescue equipment. But we needed to speed this up. We had 4 people left at the aircraft. One of them, all we ever saw was his face and his hands. That was Arlen Williams. The other 3, there was a man and 2 women still there. So we figured we got to speed this up. Joe Stiley took the ring buoy, put one arm through it and his head through it, but his shoulder was free. Priscilla Torado, he grabbed a hold of her, so he was just holding on to her. And then Patricia Felch grabbed the tow rope, but only by holding it with a bare hand. She held on for an astonishing amount of distance, considering she had a broken arm, a broken wrist, broken leg, internal injuries, and a puncture wound that caused almost her to lose her foot. They were in 29 degrees. So, you know, the hypothermia issue was very real. It's astonishing they did what they did. I guess that will to survive kind of rides everything else. So we began a trip with 3, with Patricia Felch, Priscilla Torado being held on to by Joe Stiley. Joe Stiley halfway through a ring buoy that wasn't meant for you to go all the way inside of. Not surprisingly, it wasn't very long before Patricia Felch let go. As we got closer to shore, I had to lift a little bit, which put her, because of such a short rope, it started lifting her out of the water, and she actually stayed on that rope until she was at waist level with me lifting her across ice floes and things like that before she let go. The other astonishingly good thing that occurred was after they had all met around the fuselage, the stewardess, Kelly Duncan, found a personal flotation device, and put it on Patricia Felch. So when she fell off into open water, she was actually the only one with a PFD. If she had fallen off without the PFD, she would have drowned immediately. So she was waiting there for us. Joe held on to Priscilla, and as we got to shore, we had blown all that ice ahead of us, and we had now about 20 yards where we had to physically drag them through 3-inch thick ice floes. Joe held on to her all the way to the point where they were within 20 feet of shore, lost his grip on her. She, once again, ends up on an ice floe instead of going into open water. She ends up on an ice floe. We get Joe to the shore. We're yelling at them, speed it up, we've got to get back here quickly. And we went immediately back to Priscilla because Patricia Felch was okay. She was floating. She had a PFD on. We began lifting her off of the ice floe, and she was holding on, but she only got about 10 feet and just kind of rotated, and her arms slid right out of the ring. And she rotated over onto her back and started going under. And Gene's yelling. Gene was ready to jump out of the aircraft. Of course, that meant if he jumped out of the aircraft, then I didn't have a rescue technician anymore, and he's going to be hypothermic, and we still got people to go. So right before that decision had to be made, what to do next, the water splashes, and out swims a guy in a blue shirt, swims out, grabs a hold of her, turns her over, just like a firefighter, rolls her over, swims her right back to shore again, turns her over to the firefighter standing on the shoreline. We thought it was a firefighter. It was just a guy who said, I wasn't going to stand there and watch her drown. There's no way that was going to happen. So he dove from the top of the bank in. Lenny Skutnik, yep. From the Congressional Budget Office, a clerk in the CB and the Congressional Budget Office. So now we're down to two. There's one at the fuselage. There's one floating in open water. So we turned, we went to her. Gene dropped her the rope. She said no. He told her to try and grab it again. She said no. She put her arm through it, but it pulled out right away. So said, okay, let's grab her, because I know we'd already done this before. The aviation section had been successful at water level snatches. So Gene said he was going to do that. So Gene got out of the aircraft, stood on the skid. He was not connected to anything in the aircraft but his helmet cord. So him and I talking, he was out there on his own, wedged his butt against the fuselage, put his feet in, and then I turned, and she was in the water, and I hovered right past her where I watched the skid go about that far from her head. So I could watch, and as she went by, he told me to stop. He reached down with his hand. She kind of lifted her arm. He grabbed a hold of her and then hooked on the back of her jacket and picked her up onto his boot and set her on his boot. And of course, he also told me, Don, my feet are getting wet back here. And the aircraft, when you transfer weight onto the aircraft, it's going to change the CG of the aircraft a little bit. So we went aft a little bit when we added about 120 pounds of soaking wet woman. As soon as he told me he had her, I headed right for shore, and we just slid in, dropped her, turned around, one to go. That one wasn't there.
We hope you learned something from this episode and will join us next time for another edition of Encore, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. A special thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of Encore, a series from the Precinct 444 podcast network by the National Law Enforcement Museum. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.